I'm so excited today to introduce Melanie Callen. Melanie has a master's in education from Harvard University, and she's an assistant professor at UCSF, where she works as a child development and education specialist in the Multidisciplinary Assessment Center at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. We're so excited to have her today to talk about learning issues in the post-COVID era as part of our Back to School series. And Melanie, I think you're muted right now. There we go.
Hey, welcome everyone. And I'm excited to be here and happy to answer questions. I wish I had more legitimate answers, but I'm going to do my best to sort of lay an idea of what's been going on, and hopefully if there's questions or comments that come up, please feel free to interrupt me, or we can talk at the end, in particular if people have specific patients or cases they'd like to discuss relevant to what I'm bringing up. So first off, no disclosures that I have for this talk. There are some objectives. We want to go over sort of what are to be expected learning challenges, what are atypical learning challenges, when do we look at special education or an IEP, how do we help a child or student or patient get an IEP if it's necessary, and then talking about some other resources. So we know that there are many factors that impact learning, and this is pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, forever. I just wanted to kind of highlight some that are most relevant, family, obviously, situation, community, what's going on around us and in the world at large, as well as the school, right? School environment, school climate, what are the school resources, and peers. So social, emotional, behavioral impact absolutely, and interactions absolutely impacts learning. So I think that we all are very aware of COVID's profound impact on learning as well. So looking at these same factors, family stressors compounded by COVID, such as changes to schedules, income, food security, increased family stress. I think one of the things that is so prevalent and can be challenging and not often thought of is even just space, logistics, whether a family lives in a one-room SRO or they have extra space at home so that multiple siblings can be participating in distance learning over the past year and a half, parents that are working from home, what is the noise, what is the distractions that are happening and impacting learning. So a lot of challenges just within the family, and again, working from home, which many of you are probably doing or have been doing as well. So in terms of community and society impacts on learning, I think it is so critical for us to highlight not just this past year and a half, but historically, racial injustice and our more recent political turmoil, which absolutely has impacted kids and families and school systems' ability to educate and learn. Social media and a lot of misinformation has also complicated things. And again, each school has been so variable in terms of what they can provide their students and or teachers and or families. So when we're talking about private schools or public schools, and even within school districts, there's a lot of variability. So I also think, again, we need to focus most importantly on the child as an individual learner and how COVID has impacted them. And for each child and patient, this is going to be very different. So COVID has impacted all students, and we know that the pre-existing inequities in education were further amplified by the effects of COVID on our schools and our children. So multiple reports have noted that in general, students have learned less during the lockdown year. And this is a term that's coming up more and more as this sort of COVID slide. there was an excellent study that was done fairly recently in the Netherlands that provided rich information looking at a data set covering about 15% of Dutch primary schools. The N was about 350,000 from the years 2017 through 2020. And they only looked at the impact of a very short lockdown of 8-week period. And this is, again, a school system with pretty equitable school funding, really great rates of internet access. And they still showed in this study data demonstrating that there was a loss of 3 percentile points for math, spelling, and reading for students just in that small 8-week period. They also showed that learning loss was up to 60% larger for students who came from or live in less educated households. There was an additional report that came out recently from McKinsey, which demonstrated, as we all know, that students of color were most profoundly impacted in terms of falling behind on math, and this is amongst other subjects within the US. So what do we do about this learning loss, and how do we measure it? Well, assessment, right? So when we think about how do we look at where children have been performing over the past year to year and a half, what information do we have? Is it valid? What sort of assessments were provided, if any? Also, states and local education agencies are talking about doing updated academic testing this fall. I don't know what that's going to look like, but that's what's being proposed to really decipher how much learning loss has actually taken place. And when we talk about learning loss, we often think about special education. And special education is a service for students with qualifying disabilities determined by standardized assessment tools after there has been a documentation of concerns and interventions tried. So because a student or child does not receive appropriate instruction and or is absent or truant from school, or there are academic challenges that may be related to dual language learning, that does not mean there is a disability present, and subsequently may not mean special education services are warranted. So again, learning loss is not a learning disability. To qualify for a learning disability under the IDEA educational qualifications, a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in basically learning, in spoken language, written language, reading, writing, spelling, math. That's what a learning disability is and is defined by IDEA. And this includes conditions like perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, developmental aphasia. So it's a little bit challenging because oftentimes when we're talking about learning loss, and then we're talking about learning disability, and then we're also talking about specific learning disabilities, the way that school systems define a learning disability is specific learning disability. They don't delineate per se, oh, this is dyslexia or this is aphasia, but they will say this child qualifies for special education under the category of a specific learning disability. Learning loss, again, is not a learning disability. So specific learning disability, qualifying for one, means that learning problems are not the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, and also there's a rule out of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. So school districts can determine that a child does not meet criteria for a learning disability because of one of these factors that may be the primary impacting force in that child's learning. Learning disability signifies there is significant degree of need. And the local education agency, which I will refer to as LEA, or basically school district, but encompasses charter schools as well, the school psychologist must find a student to meet at least 4 criteria in order to qualify for a learning disability and subsequently special education services. A student must fail to meet age or grade level standards in at least one academic area. a student has to show demonstrated patterns of strengths and weaknesses in academic achievement, which is measured typically through testing, or they may demonstrate a lack of progress in response to a multi-tiered intervention system, which is called RTI, or response to intervention. This can be push-in, pull-out services, small group instruction, reading support. So there has to be a demonstration that there's been some effort made to try to be preventative and supply some sort of support system at school to get that child caught up before determining learning disability. Additionally, in order to qualify for a learning disability through special education system, other disabilities are ruled out as a primary cause of academic concern. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, some of those domains. And fourth, a student's academic challenges are not the result or the primary result or function of a lack of instruction. And this is where we come to this very confusing conundrum of COVID, because of how many students and children actually were not able to access adequate instruction. And so that argument could be made. But it's important to know that these are what the federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act law states. In order to qualify for a learning disability and special education services, this is what's required, COVID or no COVID. So in order to address learning loss, should we consider special education or specialized services? Special education is not simply support. It is a service. It is a service for students with qualifying disabilities as determined by standardized assessment tools after typically there's been documentation of concerns, as well as an attempt to provide interventions, or RTI, response to interventions. Lack of instruction, school absences, and academic challenges related to, again, dual language learning do not mean there is a disability present and therefore that child should automatically qualify for special education. So I want to talk about assessment, because obviously this is something that we think of, okay, we have learning loss, we have potentially a learning disability, something going on, we need to figure out what's going on, we need an assessment. Well, how do we determine whether or not that's appropriate, and what does that look like? So in the context of COVID, we have to review, how is that student been doing prior to COVID? How were they performing in school? What were their grades? What was their attendance? What was their participation? What were any interventions that were tried? And what was the student's response to that intervention? So perhaps maybe it wasn't a formal RTI that a parent or guardian was aware of, but maybe that child or student had some additional reading support services or pull-out groups that they participated in. And that should be documented as a means of demonstrating they were already struggling pre-COVID, and now we're seeing more learning loss. Assessments, again, were not normed on school disruption. So any assessments that are administered, be they for learning disabilities or other domains, really should be considered with caution. And when we talk about doing an assessment, what does that lead to? Well, this is the question of, does it lead to a 504 plan or an IEP plan? I really, really want to spend a moment just thinking about what are the consequences of doing assessments, because oftentimes that is the go-to response when there is a concern or a question. In fact, I just before this was pulled in to see a 5-year-old who there was a question about, we need to rule out autism with a speech and language impairment. She's starting kindergarten. She had never been in a program, a formalized education program. She had started getting speech therapy remotely through Zoom. And with communicating with mom about what is the benefit or detriment of doing an assessment at this point. We are going to make a judgment about what her abilities might be, and we may not be paying attention to opportunities to really look at what are other social determinants of health and educational progress that might be affecting her. So mom was out of work, she was staying with grandfather and her godfather, who were giving her screen time, bought her own phone with her own number, having a diet that consisted largely of sweets and candy. So these are all things that impacted really how she's feeling and doing, and not necessarily looking at, oh, is this a product of a disability? So the other thing with assessment is labeling and stigmatizing and pathologizing is not necessarily how we want to go about doing things. This is something that I think it feels good sometimes to have a label, and that label can provide an intervention, but it's not always appropriate or accurate. And in particular, there is a lot of concern presently about there being over-identification or misidentification of children with disabilities, learning disabilities, ADHD, because of the impact of COVID and learning loss, and the gap in attending school in person, engaging socially with peers, etc. So we also have to think about what is the stress that goes into an assessment that's put onto a family and child. We as providers think, oh, this is great. We're going to provide a diagnostic assessment, or, go through something, but we're not necessarily always considering what is the parent's perspective. How does the child feel about this? And being aware or not aware that they may be being assessed by some new strange person. And then we have to really think about prioritizing strengths-based supports that absolutely consider a student's culture, language, race, ethnicity, and history of how they've been doing at school and how they've been treated at school. So again, labeling and assessing and diagnosing is not always the answer. And in fact, it can be counterproductive in many senses. So we need to focus on considering what is in the best interest of the child and the family. Now I'd like to review some relevant background about special education services in general. So what is FAPE? FAPE means free and appropriate public education. And anyone with a qualified disability within a school district or local education agency is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. I highlighted the word appropriate because obviously that is where things become subjective. So IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which states that any child between birth to 22 who experiences delays defined by the state, and again, measured using appropriate diagnostic instruments and procedures, shows a delay in one of the 5 major developmental domains, which we are looking at hopefully when we're doing early developmental screenings, when we're using the ages and stages or PEDS or other questionnaires in continuity clinics. So if there is a disability, we need to see that there's a significant developmental delay in one or more of the following domains. And therefore, because of that significant delay, that child requires special education and related services. So there are 13 categories of disability under IDEA. I'm not going to read through them all here, but you can see that these tend to be the labels that kids get in schools in order to qualify them for special education services. And these are not diagnoses, these are educational eligibility categories. So I also want to bring up this point, in particular, I would say related to autism. We have many families that are for the first time ever hearing the word autism because of a school district assessment that is not a medical diagnosis, that is an educational eligibility. So these are educational eligibilities that qualify a child because of their disability for special education services. Also on the top right column, you'll see that other health impairment category. This is kind of a general umbrella term, which I tend to think of as more medically mediated, where we can include things like PTSD, ADHD, and even learning disabilities or other conditions that may warrant educational services through special education. So I want to review a 504 plan because what that is definitely different than an IEP. So a 504 plan is put into place if there is a quote mental or physical impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. It is a federal civil rights law that protects against discrimination and provides a plan of how a student will have access to their learning environment at school. It outlines accommodations and modifications for the environment and or instruction, but it does not allow or dictate that that child is going to be receiving specialized instruction or services. Again, a 504 plan is designed or should be to remove barriers to learning, not to provide intervention services. These are some examples of eligibilities that qualify under a 504 plan. And again, to get a 504 plan, there typically should be some documentation, often medical documentation can help facilitate that, but there does not need to be a psychoeducational assessment or full diagnostic assessment in order to qualify for a 504 plan. An individualized education plan. This is what everyone is wondering about and seeking and curious to know. And in particular, in light of the learning loss that we know exists because of COVID, I suspect that we are going to see a big increase in referrals to find out if children are eligible for individualized education plans. So to qualify for special education and an individualized education plan, you must have one or more of the 13 conditions covered under IDEA and require services in order to access your education. So an IEP is a federal legal document which describes that student's individualized education plan, and if they are found, only if they are found eligible with a disability as defined by IDEA. So an IEP includes these domains. It can include more, but it at minimum needs to include these things. The first and foremost is what is the eligibility category. So that's back to where, again, when we're talking about learning loss, the most likely category that will be considered would be a learning disability or specific learning disability. That would be a child's eligibility for an IEP and for special education services. I'm not going to read through the list here, but you can see, as hopefully many of you have already encountered IEP documents, they can be anywhere from 3 to 60 pages long. I sometimes feel like I'm reading a legal briefing in another language, even though I've been doing this for many years. They are very overwhelming and confusing. However, they are very empowering pieces of legislation that put a parent or guardian in charge of their child's education based off of their qualifying disability. So I'm going to run through the steps towards determining eligibility for an IEP, because this is the case before COVID, during COVID, and most likely will be ongoing. So the process of figuring out, does my patient, student, child need an IEP and therefore need an assessment to determine if they qualify for an IEP, a request must be submitted. This can be submitted to the school district, the teacher, the school, saying, this child, this date of birth, on this date, we are requesting an assessment to determine if they are eligible for special education. Within 15 calendar days of the school receiving that request, or the district, even if the child attends a private school and the request is submitted, the district must respond within 15 days to determine what the assessment plan will be. It may be that the school district says, this child is not demonstrating enough to have us move forward with an IEP assessment, and therefore we are denying your request. But oftentimes, if we do have enough evidence, an assessment plan again will be provided to the parent or guardian within 15 calendar days of the written request to be signed by the parent to proceed with the full assessment. And once that assessment plan is signed, the school district has 60 calendar days to complete the full assessment. Summer does not count. Holidays do not count. Winter breaks do not count. So 60 calendar days and 15 calendar days are the timelines that must be followed. After the 60 calendar days is up, or potentially beforehand, a full assessment hopefully is completed and a report is provided and a scheduled meeting date is set for that child's initial IEP. At that meeting, they may be found ineligible. It may be that their scores or whatever concerns were brought up were not found to be at the level of them qualifying for an IEP. The parent or guardian may agree or disagree with this, and if they feel that they disagree and would like another assessment, they can appeal that decision. If the student is found eligible for an IEP, then what happens is that once the parent or guardian signs the IEP document, then services start. So they will have this meeting within 60 calendar days. And that doesn't mean that day 61 services start. Once the document is signed and agreed to, then services may start. Every 3 years, a child or student is eligible for a reassessment to continually check their status for special education services. So a triennial occurs of typically a psychoeducational assessment or speech and language assessment, or whatever assessments were done to initially qualify a student for an IEP is done every 3 years. A family does not have to wait 3 years. They can request one prior to that 3-year mark, but the district is mandated to offer at minimum every 3 years a full reassessment. So currently on the California Department of Education website, they specify that school districts must offer special education services in person when permitted to students with disabilities. And this depends on the DPH guidelines, but this was the case, has been the case for the past few months and will be moving forward. Also, assessments and timelines must be followed. This was supposed to be upheld all throughout COVID. So the past year and a half, if a request was submitted for an IEP assessment because of concerns for learning loss, the school district should respond or should have responded within the 15 calendar days with the plan and had to have completed in whatever form they can complete it in. At the time, a lot of it was virtual or partially completed. The assessments needed to be done in a timely manner and still continue to be done in timely manner. So timelines must be met. These are federal and state guidelines. There is no excuse with COVID for any kind of special education assessment or services that is warranted to not be addressed. So students with special education services or with an IEP, there may be learning loss, right? So a loss of knowledge or skills or lack of educational progress because of access to instruction, or that services or instruction was provided, but that child did not make meaningful progress and they have an IEP. That doesn't necessarily mean that that child is warranted to get compensatory education services. It means that the team, the IEP team, must come together and document the input from everyone, the parents, the guardians, the teachers, and or the child, to determine what happened in terms of that learning loss, what was or was not addressed within their IEP. And then subsequently a decision may be made to provide compensatory education. But because of learning loss, it does not mean even if you have an IEP that you automatically are going to get compensatory education services. Again, access is the key word here. So what is compensatory education for students who have IEPs or in special education services? The district, if they were unable to provide appropriate services as determined in the IEP during COVID that led to learning loss, this would warrant compensatory education. If they failed to provide a free and appropriate public education, therefore, they must determine what sort of appropriate compensatory services will be offered. Again, this is a discussion that happens within the IEP team to include the family. They must agree to it. Or if they disagree and feel that they should be offered compensatory services, that is their legal right. So there is a lot of learning loss legislation that's very recently actually been updated, but the California Assembly Bill number 86 states specifically towards in-person instruction and expanded learning opportunities grants. For the 20 to 21 fiscal year, there was a bill that was signed in March of 2021 that allowed for over $6 billion from the general fund of the Superintendent for Public Education to be appointed to the school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools, state special schools, and available for use for learning loss until August 31st, 2022. Now, this may change, but as of March 2021, the budget was increased and there was legislation put forth specifically to address learning loss that will be allocated and used through August 31st of 2022. This means expanded in-person instructional time. Of course, we have yet to see what this really looks like, but whether that be adding on days to the school year, summer school, etc., we don't know. Also, school districts and LEAs are to provide academic interventions and supports to address barriers and accelerate progress. And this is supposed to be done with prioritizing students who've been identified as needing integrated supports and academic interventions. This is for all students, but specifically needs to be prioritized for certain students. So it doesn't mean that you need to have an IEP to be able to access this learning loss legislation support services. However, again, districts have been told that they need to prioritize students who need these types of interventions, which include, first and foremost, obviously students who already have a disability or qualify for an IEP, students who are in foster care or homeless youth, English language learners, students from low-income families or with limited internet access, students with failing grades or those who have been disengaged, high school students who missed credits over the past year and a half, students who are at risk of dropping out of school, and students who are identified as needing social and mental health supports. Those are the specific categories of priority that must be put forth to who receives extra support for this learning loss given the state's legislation. What does this legislation look like? So they talk about supplemental instruction, which means that instructional programs will provide some complementary programs and services. This can include adding on to the IEP, or if a child does not have an IEP, adding on additional instructional support. Support could be, again, within the context of the IEP, but it also could be additional support to meet behavioral, social, emotional services and assist students that would need help benefiting from supplemental instruction. So this can also be considered something that if there is access to an extra program for catch up for reading or math, and that student needs a specific modality in order to access that, that should come into play. So what does the state consider supplemental instruction and support? What does that actually mean? So what they define it as is this tiered framework based on universal, targeted, and intensive supports for student needs that include academic, social, emotional, and other integrated supports. And services are provided through engaging learning experiences in a positive school climate. Learning loss legislation, how are they going to close these learning gaps with this budget? Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to go over some of the specific domains that were highlighted. Educator training, tutoring, one-to-one or small group tutoring, learning recovery programs and materials, health, counseling, mental health services, and programs to access trauma and social emotional learning, access to school meals, before and after school programs. And as part of this legislation, the state said that at least 10% of the funds must be used to hire paraprofessionals. Now, this is not, again, stipulated only for children who have IEPs. This is for anyone that has demonstrated learning loss that has a prioritized need. So these are some of the examples that are listed under the Assembly Bill 86 as what the state is hoping to provide schools and districts. I also want to highlight again that part of the legislation stipulates that the goal is to increase referrals for support for family and pupil needs, which of course is going to then most likely filter into our public health care, behavioral health systems as well. So there is very new legislation just as of last month to address the question of grade retention. This is something that comes up a lot, regardless of COVID, but I have had numerous questions over the past year about, well, this child or patient should maybe repeat a grade because they missed so much they weren't able to access. Can they stay back? Can they be held back? This is very, very new legislation. The Assembly Bill 104 was just signed on July 1st, 2021. So there is now an allowance to request retention, meaning repeating a grade. It's only considered for this school year, which, for instance, OUSD started on Monday, SFUSD starts this coming Monday. If a parent or guardian requests retention, wanting their student or child to repeat the last grade, and this goes from kindergarten up through 11th grade only. If they are graduate, they were in 12th grade last year, they are not eligible to even be considered for retention. If a parent or guardian is requesting retention, they must first make sure that their student or child meets the following criteria. They received D's, F's, or did not pass at least half of their classes for the last school year. They have to submit a request letter, and the school will hold this consultation meeting within 30 days of the request letter being submitted. And the team meets, which would include the guardian and parent, potentially the child, teacher, or school administrative staff, to discuss what are we looking at when what is the decision-making process for retaining the student? Is this a wise decision? What can we do? What needs to be done? And the decision must be reached within 10 days of holding this consultation meeting, regardless of the decision. So if a parent wants their child to repeat second grade and the school and the district say, no, we had this meeting, sorry, we're not going to do it, that does not mean that they are unable to receive the allocated interventions and supports if they have demonstrated learning loss. So what can providers do? You know, I think the most important thing that I continue to learn and will forever hopefully pay attention to is always ask. Never, ever, ever make assumptions. So even with COVID and with learning loss in school, every child, family, student's experience is different, right? And we can have a very different response from a parent than we can have from a child. In fact, the 5-year-old that I just saw about an hour ago had a 5th grade sibling who said she was really anxious about going back to school for math, but otherwise wasn't too, stressed about it, whereas mom was incredibly stressed about it. So again, thinking about when you're working with families and patients, what was your experience like during COVID? What were some of the advantages, perhaps, of distance learning or being at home or not going to school? What were some of the struggles that you had? What feedback did you get, either you, meaning if you're talking to the child or patient or student or youth, or to the parent? What information did you get from the school about your child's performance or progress? And document. So I believe we are going to have a lot of pressure put on us as providers and within the medical system to substantiate these kinds of requests and considerations. So the more that you can document during your well child checks or specialty visits, what concerns have come up, what is the patient or family's experience been with the academic year and a half during COVID, the better off they may be for future requests for support services and assessments. And then what can families do? The biggest thing is to document and communicate. So documenting what was my child or what was someone's child's ability to access their distance learning or school over the past 18 months. What did it look like? Did they log on every day? Did they log on maybe 3 times a month? Were they receiving their special education services such as speech therapy via Zoom? Were they not receiving it, or do they even know? Outlining and documenting. I tried to email the school, call the district this many times to ask about my child or what I could do. Describing any kind of barriers for that child's ability to access learning from a distance education perspective. So we had limited internet access. We had food insecurity and job schedules were challenging. And therefore my child wasn't able to log on and fully participate and benefit from accessing from their distance education over the past year to year and a half. And then families can request a meeting. So again, this is not going to be an IEP meeting, or necessarily a retention request meeting. But if they have some form of documentation, they should then request a meeting. And, there's a number of different resources. These are the resources that I tend to pull from, and in particular pull from most recently with this subject matter. I think Disability Rights California is an excellent agency, an online resource where we can gather a lot of data points for updating families and providers on what to help in terms of advocating for patients. Support for Families of Children with Disabilities is our local agency here in San Francisco. Parents Helping Parents is based in the South Bay, but also another excellent forum and space for families to gather information on specific programs and sites, laws, services, etc. Bright Futures. And then definitely the DOE website, California DOE website. Like I said, I just yesterday morning saw the update about the retention options. So that's very new. I suspect that legislation is going to continue to change and things are going to morph as we continue, hopefully resuming our in-person return to school learning. And then I have my references here, and then I'm going to stop early because I'm assuming there are some questions, or if not, whatever people want to do. So I'm happy for people to speak up and bring up their questions.
Yes, Melanie Callen, thank you so much for joining us today and giving this talk. I think this is a really important topic that's going to be coming up a lot over the next couple months, and this was very helpful. Everyone, please put your questions in the chat, and I'll read them out. Additionally, we have here on the slides, you can see the QR code actually for checking in. I'm just going to make sure it's yes. So you can use your phone, take a photo of the QR code, and then that will record your attendance for purposes of CME. So please enter your questions in the chat. We have a comment from Ben Newman regarding kind of the time frame for IEPs. He mentioned that the timelines are only told for breaks of 5 days or more. So the longer breaks like winter break, summer break.
So yeah, and I'm so glad Ben is here because he's representing the district and many others. And I, something that I'm glad to get that clarification point. I will say, unfortunately, we've had a number of patients that were told, even by specific therapists with assessments, that, oh, well, it was President's Day or this day or that day were added in for holidays. So I'm glad to hear from an official that it's only summer breaks and winter breaks, but that's valid and critical information for families to know, especially when these timelines need to be followed. Any other questions or?
Let's see, we got Petra just wrote one. She wrote, wonderful presentation. How have you been able to work through the challenges in getting assessments done, given quarantine precautions? And do you have advice for the year ahead?
So, we have been, at least at the general and within MDAC, we've returned to doing some in-person assessments. I think we can gather a lot of information from communicating with families and parents, from communicating with schools and other agencies working with families. I don't believe that every child that is behind or struggling needs to have an assessment. An assessment is only helpful if we know the intervention required necessitates it. I also, with doing a lot of Zoom observations and patient visits, we can get a lot of rich data points. Another thing is, honestly, and this is something I just spoke to this mom about an hour ago, was that, we do need to give it some adjustment time, right? We can't make an accurate or valid assessment, even if I use standardized tools right now, for a child who has not been in school, who has not received their full IEP services that they were supposed to be getting over the past year for whatever reason. So, I really think referring for assessments should not be our first line of defense. I think it is asking questions.
And I was just notified that sorry, one moment here, that the QR code was for the last meeting. So I'm now putting up the updated QR code. Sorry, I'm gonna go to the end here. Oh gosh.
Okay.
So are you guys able to see it okay from here? Okay. And then, so we have a question about, could you review how, due to lack of educational exposure or opportunity, may kind of relates to the challenges during the pandemic?
So again, this is, as I mentioned, about access, right? So being able to document how a child or student has been able to access their distance learning or their educational program throughout COVID. And if they were unable to access, that may be enough to warrant putting in place supports and interventions, regardless of special education or IEP factors. I don't know if that, happy to answer more. I'm not quite sure what the question is related to.
They wrote back, thank you. And I think we just have 2 minutes left. One question I have is, I'm curious if you had a kind of, if there are patients that we're seeing that there may be concerns about being disengaged, where they don't necessarily have a diagnosis or would meet criteria for a 504 or IEP, but we think they could benefit from the LEA's support. Kind of what your first steps to recommend to us or families would be to try to get that extra support.
Yes. So again, like I mentioned, the documentation is critical. So if a family can say my child logged in or accessed and received the information and still struggled because of maybe some underlying condition or challenge, that may be warranting an assessment. If they were not provided with sufficient material or information and were therefore unable to access it, that's also on the school or the district in terms of their responsibility. I think that, again, documenting what the child participated in, what they struggled with, and then communicating back to the school or teacher is going to be the most critical first step. But we have to consider that all children, most children, I will say, returning to school are going to be behind, are going to demonstrate some kind of loss. And that going to vary depending upon whether it's in math or their social emotional well-being or their self-esteem or their attention. So it's going to vary, but we don't have an even level playing field. We never have. And I think that COVID has really highlighted the fact that we can't make our expectations set. I think it's going to be a period of adjustment to get there.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much again. And we're at time, but we've got the updated QR code up on the screen. So if anybody hasn't gotten a chance, make sure it should, when you click on it, you'll see that it's for the Back to School Part 2 learning challenges for today, 8/12.
And I'm happy to have people reach out to me if they want to email me or call me about specific patients or cases. Glad to always be a resource and reference as best as I can.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you all for participating. Let's see, we'll give people a few minutes. I don't know, should I log off now or looks like there's
Yeah, I think I was just holding out for a moment to give people a chance to scan it. But thank you so much. And I think we're all set.
Okay, great. All right. Well, let me know. Yeah, if anyone, and again, people can contact me via email as well if there's anything that comes up.